One will seldom go wrong if one attributes the extreme actions to vanity, average ones to habit, and petty ones to fear. Friedrich Nietzsche. Yes, we're back. We're back at the tipping point. Our show today is titled Civil Nations on the Path to Re-Migration. My name is Mike Boyle. That hasn't changed since last week. And as always, I have ideas in my head, and these concepts have been brewing around for a while. But to be perfectly honest, I'm not quite sure what's going to come out the end. So I will be as surprised as you are. But that's okay, because we're all along for the same ride. For this subject, there were a number of triggers that spurred on these thoughts, and as mentioned, they don't come from one day to the next. They've been percolating in my head for a long, long time. But we had some certain events that have taken place that you know all too well. So I won't need to go into too much detail as to describe this concept of re-migration, perhaps maybe explain it from different perspectives. But that the initial trigger for me was understanding within the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So what are the real triggers? The 22nd of February was, in my mind, a symptom, whereas the trigger took place a long time ago. And I will not go into detail. I don't need any hate mail. And besides, there's never one truth, in spite of our conditioning that in that dualistic way that we consider near and dear to our hearts. But I think one of the triggers was with Poroshenko declaring that there was no such thing as a Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and declared that there is a Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And I think that at that point in time, Putin was playing Rumpelstiltskin. And when you start digging into that subject, you understand that we are talking about our kinship through a common civilization. There's a word that we mix up quite often with nationhood. They're, in my mind, are completely different, and that will be certainly one of the avenues that I'd like to explore within the show. But if we believe in the concept of the constitutive other, so we are the way that we are because they are that way, then that decision from Poroshenko was actually quite poignant, because basically they were saying, we do not belong to your culture. It's almost like saying, we are no longer part of your family. And we see within the conflict after the 22nd of February various indicators that more or less attenuate that initial action from Poroshenko. That being that Christmas is now celebrated on the 25th of December and not on the 7th of January. Again, we are this way because you are that way. And we don't belong to you anymore. That's the clear message. And I think for certain powers in this world who are very keen on ensuring that we have clarity with regards to that civilization question in Ukraine, that those powers have won. They've won. We have another situation that's since the 7th of October, where same rules apply, the constitutive other, because we are this way because you are that way. So we make a clear differentiation between us and them. And with that, it makes everything else so much easier. It makes it easier to manipulate people. It makes it easier to continue with your folly. And it makes it very easy to ignore a lot of facts. And the third, because all good things come in threes, the third element is that of what we've been hearing for last month, I think, perhaps a month and a half, this concept that has all of a sudden, like the phoenix, has raised its head as if it never left. The question of remigration. What are we assuming when we talk about remigration? That means you are not from here. That's the comment we're making. You are not from here. That means you belong somewhere else. And it doesn't matter what you do. We don't need you anymore. You might have served a purpose at one time, but in actuality, you're just kind of getting in the way. And I might be repeating something that you already know, but under the fear that you might never hear this, it's better you hear it twice than not at all, that this concept of remigration has been around for a long time. And our friend Adi was one of the instigators about 70 years ago. And the idea is, well, you are not from here, so we need to send you somewhere else. And at that point, we were talking about Madagascar. We talked about Cyprus. And I'm sure there were some other destinations that were part of the agenda. But the whole idea was, well, you're not from here, so you belong somewhere else. So we need to go ahead and pack you up. So in my mind, all of these thoughts are very much tied to this concept of civilization. So to which civilization we belong to. And in how nationhood is sometimes gotten in the way. Or this nationalism, or this patriotism, which is like a poison. It's a weapon that's used to accomplish your own objectives. So let's start with this concept of civilization. What are we actually talking about when we talk about civilization? More or less, we're talking about some sort of shared core values or beliefs. So that means that we might be doing things different, but in the heart of hearts, we have the same goals, we have the same beliefs, we have the same values. And with that, taking on that attitude, then the rest of it is having different languages or perhaps somewhat different customs is less of an issue, because we're saying that we come from the same, and following the actions that took place in the Tower of Babel, that, we kind of separated, but we still come from the same source. Within this concept of civilization, we're also talking about some sort of cultural continuity. That means it's not something that that came through decree, but rather it's developed through time, and we can follow that path. And it's something that we can all relate to in some fashion, because we can follow that timeline. It means something to us. Perhaps a cultural exchange, that we see that we're different within the language and possibly the customs, although I tend to think that the customs are probably more similar than we are willing to realize. But there's going to be something a little bit different. And so we're curious. We want to find out what exactly is that all about. And so that cultural exchange within the same civilization is also very, very important. And of course the historical narratives, but although I think this is where we start getting into a more difficult terrain, because when we talk about historical narratives or institutions, that is more often a means by which people are manipulated, and we know the story with history, that history is written by the victors or the powerful, and inevitably history has different perspectives. Now, I'm going to be a little bit radical today, and I know that those of you who listen to the show are going to be totally flabbergasted that I'm going to be radical. But I'm going to make a statement, especially when we're looking at European civilization. This is a subject we talk about a lot. That the tipping point for European civilization started about 100 years ago. Now, there was a book that I stumbled across a few years ago, and I had to look up the title in English because I know this book in German. It's from an author by the name of Öden von Horvath. And the book is called in English, The Eternal Philistine. And I thought it's very interesting, this translation of why they used a Philistine. I understand. I was indoctrinated with the Bible as well. I could have called him a Gentile, but regardless, it doesn't quite fit the German term. But this book was truly fascinating for me. You know, when you run across either a theater piece or a novel or something that is a cultural landmark of the specific time, looking at it from a historical narrative, we forget very often that the way that we looked at things was not always in a continuum. In other words, we had different thoughts of how things actually took place, that we remember things different, that our perception of the here and now is very much influenced by the narrative that we're getting bombarded daily. I can think of too many examples, and I guess that's one of the few advantages that you have in being a little bit older, that you remember that it actually used to be quite different. Let me give you one example before going back to my comment of the change in European civilization taking place about 100 years ago. I remember when the Berlin Wall fell, and I remember what it was like in East Germany prior to the fall of the wall, and I knew the narrative that was coming from both sides, and the hysteria that took place after the 9th of November, 1989. And I went to an exhibition in Berlin. This was in the History Museum, and they were talking about something that I already went through. And I'm thinking the whole time, did they see another movie? I didn't see this movie. I saw something completely different. Furthermore, this is much more complex than the story that they're actually spitting out. And then you start to think, so what's the objective here? What are they trying to accomplish by putting this narrative on there? And I'm sure you could think of all kinds of examples of where the narrative is manipulated to fit whatever the purposes of the one who's actually the instigator here. Well, within this book from von Horvath, he talks about a situation in Europe right after the First World War. And this was, for me, it was totally fascinating because he was alluding to a lot of things that have been pushed to the side completely within the realm of what we consider European history. But they were living relics at that time. The idea of a pan-European being, which was very often mentioned within the book. And we forget that it was not just countries at war. There was a real battle going on as to how this continent is supposed to work. We don't talk enough about the League of Nations. We don't talk about the the experience that were taking place that unfortunately got totally derailed. When we think about the socialist movement, the idea was, forget all this nationhood stuff. We are brothers and we have one cause. Unfortunately, that didn't last very long. As soon as the First World War hit, then all the socialists said, yes, we're brothers, but these brothers are more important than your brothers. And so, which was very, very unfortunate. I think that we had a real opportunity at that time to say, we're not going to fight. We're just not going to fight. So we know what took place, what happened in the First World War, and something that, of course, being an American, we do not learn at school. And you'll run across some films. I think the Americans in Paris, very often, those depictions that took place in the 20s would allude to it, but not go into but always from the victor, never from the afflicted. And that was the interesting part about von Horvath's book, because he depicts the situation. I'll give you a couple of examples. He talks about, and this was written from Austria, which was very, very fascinating, traveling to Italy, and the Italians being the victors, and the message was, well, they're going to show you at the border that they are the victors. That was part of the message. The other one was, you're a loser, you have to keep your mouth shut. That was another message that was quite clear. But then as this book transpires, they talk about the American influence. The American influence that was taking place in Europe right after the First World War. And that was really fascinating. That was truly an eye-opener in I'm using this word on purpose, the prostitution that took place between individuals to kiss the American ass, to put it very bluntly. And von Horvath goes into detail and talks about, but not in a finger-pointing way. He described it, in my mind, in a matter-of-fact way, a way that was painting a picture of what Europe actually looked like. And it's not the one that we get in the history books. And so after having the spark, and I'm sure there were a number of sparks that took place, I started researching into this subject. And of course, as you know, I try to research a little bit for the show, and I came up with some really interesting facts. The first one is that there was a huge backlash tied to jazz. That jazz was, and it was also very interesting that you had a clear correlation between U.S. and Afro-Americans. If you go through the history of Europe in the 20s and the backlash against Americans were black. And so it was a backlash against jazz. And I ran across one fact that it took place in 1926 in Berlin. There was a riot that took place tied to a jazz concert. And so the individuals, and then unfortunately our friends in the Nazis were very, very strongly behind all of this. In the idea, sometimes when we protest, what we're protesting is almost like the symptom, but we're not really going to the root cause. And in this particular case, it was the American hegemony. And so the jazz represented the American superiority, and of course, unfortunately, my countrymen were very blatant, as we tend to be, that in making sure that everybody knew that we're the ones with money here. And I knew about this other one. I found all kinds of examples, not just in Germany, in Italy. There was an anti-jazz sentiment pretty much mastered by Mussolini, who was already in power. I think he got into power in 20 or 22, something like that. In Spain, directly related to the Catholic Church, and we were losing our morals. We're losing our morals. And I thought that was quite indicative, because within this concept of civilization and values, aren't all these things tied together, right? Aren't they tied together? There isn't there was an example coming from Vienna, which I thought was, and I read about this one a long time ago, that Josephine Baker was supposed to perform at the Ronacher. And they had to call it off because there were riots on the streets. Eventually she did come back, but that was, when I first stumbled across that, it blew my mind that there would be such a reaction, because we always assume that everybody just, they accept the way things are and they move forward. But we have to remember, here in Austria, there was a real struggle going on, right? There was a struggle because you didn't have the empire anymore. That civilization was the monarchy. And so we didn't make the differentiation between all of these countries. Of course, we had some groups who were more superior than others, so there's no question about that. But it was all considered to be the same civilization. And if you travel through these areas of the monarchy, you'll pick up on small things that are very similar. This might sound funny, but that we would all use the same name for certain fruits and vegetables. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're coming from one particular nationality or one language. And in fact, it becomes much more of a mixture, and you don't make this differentiation anymore. You are saying that we are one, and we are willing to take those things from other cultures if we find value in them. And then you have this continuum that takes place, which is very, very fascinating. But Austria was struggling, and of course then that's when we come up with this idea of the land of the mountains, and our identity is very much tied to our geographic location, where we are. And basically we're rewriting history because we didn't have one. We felt that we lost our civilization. And I mentioned Austria. I'm sure that you had numerous examples taking place throughout all of Europe where this type of activity was already taking place. But Austria is the one I know. This is the one I researched the most. And so we leave it at that. Yeah, so that struggle for civilization, which is much more important than we give credit for, because our focus is always on nationalism. We're always talking about nations. And what we tend to forget is that this concept of nationhood is a relatively recent phenomena. And we go back to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, I believe, where, of course, that was the end of the Holy Roman Empire, and where the area that we consider Germany today was truly decimated. After 30 years of war, there wasn't much left. And we had, of course, the British, who had already gone through their civil wars. And in fact, I remember the Second English Civil War was roughly around that time. I think it was about 20 years before the end of it was definitely during the 30 Years' War. And then, of course, we have 1789 and the storming of the Bastille, and we have the French, and this whole idea of nation within the country where most people didn't speak French. And so we continued on this path. And with the fall of the various monarchies, and I've had some talks with some individuals here, especially looking at the two Balkan wars that I think we're still fighting today, that we're still trying to decide, so are you on that side or are you on this side? We're not quite sure. And actually, this has all gotten really messy because we all used to live together, and now we need to we have to make some sort of decision here. We have to claim that we either belong to one side or we belong to another side. And we, after so many years, we still haven't gotten our heads around it. And in fact, this one doesn't seem to get any better. It just seems to get worse. And it seems to be a weapon that's continuously used to keep people docile. I think that's what it is. It's a method that we use to keep people docile. You're listening to Radio Tipping Point. Boyle is my name. And our subject today is civil nations on the path to remigration. And that's a pretty dour way of looking at things, I know. But I'm afraid that if I look at the current situation that we have here, and certainly not just in Europe, this idea of nationhood, of course, is, if you want to talk about one fallacy, it's the United States and nationhood, because actually the people who formed that area, they've been pretty much eliminated. So that means that actually we have no commonality because we all came from somewhere else. We have no common civilization, so we have to put together a pretty good story, right? And we have to drill it down your throat every day because we're so afraid that people aren't going to drink the Kool-Aid anymore, right? They're not going to drink that Kool-Aid. And once they start negating those things that we say, then this whole basis is pretty unstable, right? This whole model is very unstable. So we better bring out the flag. We better start talking about all that patriotism stuff again, because that's the only glue that holds this thing together. Because we know it's all based on a house of cards. Yeah. So where does that actually lead us today when we look at civilization, a topic that maybe we should talk a little bit more, but not in an us versus them perspective, but looking for those commonalities that we have between all of us. And there are plenty of them out there. I'm not going to be able to cover them all in the 57 minutes I have for the show. No siree, bub. No way. Can't do it. But I think it's about time for us to start thinking, what are those commonalities? What are those common values that we have? Another element that just kind of popped into my mind when we talk about religions. We know how religion has been our Achilles heel, primarily here in Europe, but not exclusively. I already alluded to the 30 Years' War, and we know that was all tied to the Catholics and the Protestants. And we know about the Crusades. We know very well here in Vienna about the Turkish attacks that took place twice here. But what we don't talk about is actually, we're all Western religions, right? So when we talk about Western religions, then if we're talking about civilization, then that must infer that we're talking about some sort of common values. Or are we saying that within the West we have different values? No, I don't think we're saying that. Actually, what we're saying is that within a Western civilization, read my lips, Western civilization, that means that we're talking about those commonalities, those common things that we believe in, those things that we believe in. And so therefore, if we were to broaden the scope of what we toss into this bucket that we're calling civilization, then that should really include Islam. And it has the same roots. We know this. But it's the story that we love to manipulate this one, right? We love to manipulate it. And we see certain tendencies, again, looking at this question of civilization. I came to the conclusion a while back that there was a close correlation between that switch that we went from civilization, that commonality that we have between peoples, where we didn't have this thing of borders, where we understood that, yeah, people speak different languages, but there is some sort of affinity that we have. Those wars that are being fought, they actually have nothing to do with you and me. They're the people that are running this place where, of course, we have nothing to say there. We have nothing to say. And that means that actually I have no problem with you. And in fact, what you do and what I do, I can't say when one stops and the other one starts, because I see a certain continuum there too, that we have a lot of customs that are pretty damn similar, I'd say. They're pretty damn similar. But when we look at this, let's go back to the historical perspective, and when the civilization part started to recede a little bit, and when the nationhood took place, man, we pulled out all the cards. Let me give you an example of another one I stumbled across a long time ago. Being the inquisitive type, especially tied to history, I don't know how many years ago this was. I stumbled across a book that was talking about 19th century history, and it was put together in a really fascinating way, not talking it from our perspective, in other words, the way that our narrative works today, but rather taking snippets of those things that were actually being disseminated at the time, unfiltered, and it allows you to have a better insight as to what the motives were of the people that what they were trying to do. And it was all tied to the Greek War of Independence, let's see how good my memory is on this one, 1821 to 1829, something like that. And this was a true cause célèbre in the German-speaking world. And I suspect not just in the German-speaking world, but in various areas. In fact, I stand corrected. It was not just in the German-speaking world, because you had this return to Hellenicism that was taking place in the 19th century. We tend to think that people like Aristotle and Socrates and the like, and Plato, that they were always on our greatest hits, that we would go to the Wurlitzer and always, let's go ahead and listen to Aristotle today, or maybe let's check out Socrates. No, it wasn't always that way. That we go through ebb and flow with these so-called heroes, and this was taking place in the 19th century, very much tied to the Greek War of Independence, where all of a sudden they say, yeah, but this is our history. Plato is our history. Socrates is our history. Aristotle is our history. And I'm going out on a limb because I can't prove this, but I'm going to make an assumption, and I won't feel bad if somebody proves me wrong. But I tend to think that the emphasis that we had on Greek literature, and I'm thinking about Homer primarily, but not exclusively, but all of the Greek gods, and all of the fables that were coming out of Greece, which of course we all know it's not just Greece, that we're talking about a whole area. Greece is a nation that was more or less created, that represents a number of nations today, where we don't make the differentiation between a Greece or in all of its neighbors, because they didn't make the differentiation. So in any case, let me go back to the true impetus here. That within this book that I was going through, they were going on about how people in Europe need to support Greece in their War of Independence. And you know the trigger that they used? I hope you're all sitting here. I hope you make yourself comfortable, because it's going to blow your socks off. They said the rationale was because they were the Christians. They were the Christians. And so we have a moral obligation to support the Greeks here, because here we are supporting Christianity. Yep. And of course that story goes on and on and on. And we see how once that trigger has got another thing that I only learned around the same time, because it wasn't part of my history, is this whole idea of German nationhood. And if we look at Goethe, and that Goethe was truly bitter about the reaction that came from the Prussians tied to this idea of German nationality. or let's use a different word, because I hate this word nationhood. Ethnicity. Let's use ethnicity. That with the acknowledgement of German ethnicity, which of course back then, if you were to show the colors of the German flag, that was considered to be heresy, and you were to be shot at sight. And Goethe was truly crestfallen. Of course, we have to remember that Goethe, like very often, especially for those that were more like the noblesse, would not stay in one place all the time. They were all over the place, and they didn't make that differentiation, right? And so we set the European house on fire, and we just keep on. We cannot hold ourselves back. We keep pulling out the matches. And so, it's a very long introduction to something that is probably more poignant to us right now than anything else, and that is really to the sorry state that we've brought it to today. That again. The advantage that you have in being a little bit older is that you know that there was another narrative, and there were other hopes. And I remember the hopes that we had after 1989, that means the war is over, and that now it's time for us to join forces, and that we work together. That others had other motives, that's another story. But that was the narrative. And I remember very distinctly in the early 90s where the European Union was specifically with an individual who just passed away back in December. He was 98 years old, Jacques Delors, who was the one who truly tried to seize the day with the expansion of the EU and the idea of the euro and the whole Maastricht Treaty and the like. But I remember this narrative that we had, that going back to, if we look at civilization as being like nature, you can go ahead and mow your lawn, you can build your house, and you can try to get rid of all the weeds and keep the rodents at bay. But the fact is, if you do nothing, then everything will go back to a natural state, right? So it'll all go back to a state that you thought that you eliminated for good, because of course, as being the Anthropocene, the superiority of the human being, then we feel that we can manage all that, and so we take the same attitude in the way that we work with each other and how we set up these borders and how we manage things. Well, in my mind, what we were saying back then was those things that belong together just come together. And a lot of the conflicts that we created that didn't need to be, and it was very much tied to this idea of nationalism. Of course, it goes to a lot of other things. I keep mentioning this term. Obviously, these conflicts are much more complex. But still, the idea that we were talking about in early 90s, with those areas that belong together, they would just form together, and it wouldn't make any difference anymore. And that was the hope that we had. That was the hope that we had at the time, that we would, and I never thought of it this way before, but actually that was our longing to reach that cultural natural state that just belongs together. And we know for a fact that if within that narrative, we're really talking about establishing tolerance, right? Because they are different, and it doesn't bother us. We don't look at this as being a threat. And in fact, we see, but actually, this area that we keep talking about, where they are different than us and the like, it all becomes kind of muddy. And I mean this in a very positive way. That it's not so clear cut. It isn't in reality. This is This is an artifact that we've created. But just the same, then it becomes very unclear. And that's good. For me, that's very good, because that means I've negated this concept of the constitutive other. I put this one to bed, and I've taken the stake and I've put it through the heart of the constitutive other. And we delegate it to the history books. Wouldn't that be great if we can delegate the constitutive other to the realm of the history book, that we realize that this is the way people were at one time? Wouldn't that be worth striving for? But we know today we are very, very far away from all of this, right? When we hear that this idea of citizenship that really means nothing, right? That means that you don't have, you think that, okay, you've made the compromises. You are integrated. That means that you have left your previous culture to the side. And I've come to the conclusion that this word that we use quite often, and we're hearing it, unfortunately, we're in an election year here in Austria, and you see it, that we're all talking about integration. And it doesn't matter which party you're talking about, they're all come up with this integration stuff. You know what? I came to a conclusion that this word that we use called integration, it's actually a euphemism that means assimilation. Now, let me explain to you the difference, the way that these words are being used and what was really intended. Integration would mean that you would have two equal parties that are merging together to become one. I don't think that's what they mean here. What they mean is, this is our culture, get with the program. And if we have an inkling that you are not with this program, man, we're gonna send you on the next bus out of town, because we don't need you, because you're just causing problems. And this is the ironic thing, that today when we keep talking about diversity and inclusiveness, which when you think about this whole picture, it has to be the biggest package of BS you're ever going to run across, because nobody's really keen on diversity. Nobody's an absolute. I correct myself. There are some people that are keen. I have a few people here in the studio today who feel the same way as I do. So this is very important, that we are able to relish in our new experience. But that does not mean that we negate our previous experience and that core of who we actually are. And the real problem, and of course for those that have gone through the migrant experience, you realize that you are neither fish nor fowl. You really don't belong to any of the groups anymore. You belong to, I have to go back, and this is the irony of it all, because of this situation where we are compelled to make a choice. Although there is really no physical necessity to make a choice, there is nothing natural about making this choice. And that's really my point. There's nothing natural about making this choice. But we are compelled to make this choice. And that means that you are forced to negate those things that are part of you, actually, right? They're part of you. There was a call that I had that was tied to a project I'm working on, and it was talking to somebody in Canada who came from Syria, and I was giving my opinion as to the situation in showing support and that it's not on anybody's radar screens right now, but this is still an open wound that we have here, and it's not being addressed because it doesn't fit into the newspapers. We have too many other stories to broadcast, and the serious stuff is old news, right? Nobody's interested in old news, so let's just park it. And we assume that the problem goes away, right? So the 2 million refugees in Turkey, that they just got to go away. That Lebanon, which is already a failed state, is totally swarmed with Syrians. Look at Jordan, the same story. And I noticed in his attitude that he didn't want to go there, and it wasn't in a bad way. He learned you don't talk about these things. And I think this has everything to do with the subject. This is the interesting part about this assimilation. And it's one of those things, once you're no longer at the place where you come from, you are compelled to look at things from different perspectives because you're neither fish nor fowl. And to take on Theresa May's saying that you know that you're a citizen of nowhere, right? You are a citizen of nowhere. That allows you to look at things in certain perspectives that you wouldn't be able to look at otherwise. And I noticed in his reaction, those things he didn't say, they spoke volumes, right? They spoke volumes because he felt that within this realm of integration, aka assimilation, because you don't want to talk about things that people are going to feel uncomfortable with, because it's something that they don't feel familiar with, that they don't feel that is part of them, and where they live is only part of them, and they don't understand that this is there's an evolution that's taking place. Well, you learn very quickly. In fact, it reminds me of another story too that I like to tell you about if I have time. Yeah, I got time. He didn't say anything, and the reason why he didn't say anything was because he knows he needs to keep his trap shut, right? He needs to keep his mouth shut. And when we talk about this whole stuff with integration, basically we're saying, these are problems you brought with us. We don't need your problems. Deal with your problems, but don't get us involved. Don't get us involved. Apart from the fact that let's stay with Syria. Who caused this thing, right? Who caused the problem? And we're all guilty. I'm afraid we're all guilty. And if we think that we're not guilty, then we're solely mistaken. Yeah, there's another story. This was a time that back in the 90s, I had to go back to the States for some reason. And I think there were shoes that I had to have repaired. So I went to the cobbler. They still have them in the United States. You have people, and just like here in Austria, they're all ethnic. No Yankee Doodles are doing this work. They're all coming from somewhere else. And I asked him a question that he probably had never gotten before, or doesn't get too often. Certainly hadn't gotten it for a while. I asked him where he was originally from, and I told him why I was asking him, because I'm inquisitive, and I told him a little bit my story. Damn, if it wasn't like a floodgate of emotions that came from this guy. He was some sort of prisoner. I'm going to say concentration camp, but in any case, he had papers to prove it. And damn, if this guy didn't have the papers in the front drawer of his desk. What does that tell you? What does that tell you? This guy had his papers of him being a prisoner in the front drawer of his desk. That means he was living it every day. But the problem that we have, even for those assimilated migrants, when you do not know that they're a migrant, and of course, I'm never going to fall in that category. I've come to terms. But we have in this country individuals that were born here. They were born here. They don't know anything else. They have, of course, the culture that are coming from their parents, and that's still very strong. But you talk to them, they're speaking to you in dialect, right? They're speaking to you in dialect. But even there, we're still believing in the constitutive other, right? Because you're one of them because you're not one of us. Although you don't know anything else. How are you supposed to feel? How are you supposed to feel in that situation? And I'm afraid this one's gotten much worse. And the question that I have is it going to get even worse before it gets better? You know, you keep thinking that it can't get worse. That we have hit rock bottom, right? We've really hit rock bottom. And then something happens and you realize that no, this one can get much, much worse. So where does this leave us? Anno 2024. Where does this leave us? I'd like to think that we as individuals have the power to define not only who we are, but damn what we stand for, right? In spite of everything. In spite of everything. Because this fear that's getting rammed down our throats is just a tool of manipulation, folks. It's just a tool of manipulation. So I wish for all of you, this is what I wish. And we're still somewhat in the middle, at the beginning of the week. Let's say we took Monday off. This is the first day of the week, right? I'm going to give you that leeway. So we have a whole week to work on this one, right? So I'd like you to realize that you could do something about it. And of course, this is going to be a small piece, right? Because if we think that we're going to change the world, then we're only going to be disappointed. But if we believe in those common values, of that comment that I made in the beginning of the show, we believe in those common values, and we believe that it's not just me, it's us. Using the example of one of the best poetry I ever ran across from Muhammad Ali, and it was called Me, We. And that's the story. If we realize that it's we and not just me being out there on our own, what can we accomplish? And I would hope that we would all collectively be able to put this remigration ghost back into the box, and perhaps if we could, while we're taking the spike and taking it to the constitutive other, can we take it to this remigration concept, please? Can we? Because there would be nothing that would make me happier than to place the stake into the remigration ghost and relegating that one to history. Put it to history. Like I told you, I didn't know where this one's going to take me today. And that's good that it's like that. Because that means that we are allowing ourselves not to come up with the answer before we're able to ask the question, right? We're so trained to try to fit the path into this preconceived answer that we think is right, or what's expected of us, even more pronounced, what's expected of us, that we don't allow ourselves the ability to be very emergent in accepting those things that come out. And sometimes, those things that come out aren't always that nice. Because you know why? We're not always that nice. I'd love to pronounce something else, but within that idea of situational versus dispositional, I am firm belief that there's a little bit of devil, there's a little bit of angel in all of us, but it's really the conditions that we are placed in that allow for those things to be a bit highlighted, that things are not so clear-cut. And I think the last thing I would like to pass on to you in these last few minutes that we have together is that I wish you the power to accept not only the way things are, not to agree with them, and I'm talking primarily about human relations, but to accept yourself the way you are, right? Accept the way you are, blemishes and all. Because only then are we able to get rid of all of these demons I've been talking about, going from the constitutive other to this remigration. Try that one 5 times real quick. Remigration. Because we owe it to each other, but primarily we owe it to ourselves, right? If we're not able to define what our own needs are and how this falls in line with everything else in the grand scheme of things, then how will we ever expect ourselves to make any progress? It's just not going to happen. I've reached the last minute of the show, folks. Yes, you are going to be spared in 45 seconds. But before I let you off, I'd like to thank you for listening. I'd like to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to indulge in some of these thoughts. I hope you found some sort of added value in all that. And I very much look forward to joining you next week in the next rendition of Tipping Point, which is, by the way, World Radio Day. And I will be reading a theater piece that I, with a little bit of help from AI, created on my own, and I'd be keen on passing it on to you next week. So take care.